have a seat. Mr. Miranda, Mr. Saldonio, Mr. Tisdale, President, State's President. The jury's not.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Just very briefly, the defense made a statement this morning during the discussions that we were having with respect to waiving the statutory mitigator with respect to or the specifically identified statutory mitigator regarding significant criminal history. I want a commitment on the record that they are waiving that's not going to be addressed, because I've formulated my cross-examination of the doctor to eliminate specific, although I still think I would be legally entitled to do it. I think it would be proper and correct type of cross-examination. I'm not going to ask him about the defendant's drug use, drug dealing activities, purchasing of firearms, and things of that nature. We will, of course, be talking about all of his encounters with law enforcement, because that's a foundational fact for his opinion. But my point to you is, I don't want to forego the opportunity to cross-examine him on that and then have them come back and ask you to instruct the jury on the mitigator. So I'm asking for a waiver, an irrevocable waiver of that mitigator on the record at this point.
Ms. Miranda?
Judge, I believe I did that this morning.
Ms. Miranda?
Judge, I believe I did that this morning.
Okay. Sounds sufficient to me. Okay. Y'all ready, Mr. Miranda, ready to have the jury come in?
Yes.
State ready to have them come in?
I am, yes.
Okay. Mr. Riles, if you would, please. Okay, thank you all for bearing with us. We appreciate your attention. Miranda, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon.
We're going to start off where we kind of left off earlier, but before we get there, I'm just going to ask you a question about have you taught any courses dealing with police officers or teaching police officers?
Yes, over the years, it's quite some time ago now, but I did tutoring on applied psychology to New York State police investigators. I did a program for the FBI and have a letter of appreciation from the director of the FBI for the program on school shooters. There are often police officers in the lectures and speeches I give. Last year in South Africa, I did a program that was heavily attended by police leadership. So I have some experience in an educative role with police.
Okay. Now, getting back to the topic that we started before we went to lunch, we were talking about racism, right?
Yes.
Okay. What would be your opinion if you heard that Eriese made racist comments?
It certainly wouldn't be surprising.
Why is that?
Well, because, there is a phenomenon of what some people call black racism.
What does that mean?
That means particularly young black people who mouth off making racist comments, but I think it's generally understood as a reaction to the preponderance of the problem, which is the history, legacy, and reality of white racism.
And so how does the Black Lives Matter movement, how does that fit into what you just said?
Well, it fits in the sense that people say, well, white lives matter, but in a sense that's not the issue. If most of the people being killed in confrontations with police are black, whether they're innocent or guilty, armed or unarmed, the big issue is that kind of crime, not the reverse of that. So that's an example, I think.
In your opinion, what are other factors that compound this reaction to racism?
Well, I think something that's very important and relevant here is what has been called the Southern culture of honor.
Okay, now what is that, the Southern culture of honor?
Historians have demonstrated that in the Old South, starting from the colonial period, this idea that honor is critically important and that disrespect is intolerable took root as part of the cultural history of the Old South. This has been well demonstrated by historians. And psychologists even studying this have found that, for example, in a laboratory situation, if you have Southern young men come down a hallway and somebody bumps into them and insults them, not only do they say more aggressive things, but their bodies respond with a stronger physiological response than if you have Northern young men in the same situation. So it's as if a cultural tradition becomes a psychological issue, which ultimately can be manifest as a physiological response.
And in your opinion, how does this apply to Erice's childhood development?
Well, I think it applies in two ways. He spent much of his childhood in the South, but it's also important to recognize that the Southern culture of honor, which was a creation of the white Southerners who ruled the South, was learned by African Americans in the 17th, 18th, even 19th century, and was in many ways incorporated into African American culture. And so it's very often you hear parents telling kids, if somebody insults you, don't come home unless you've, punched them down or knocked them down or responded. But it starts, for example, with John C. Calhoun in his autobiography, senator from South Carolina, saying that his mother taught him if he was out in the community and somebody disrespected him or his family, she said there's only two acceptable outcomes. Either you kill that person or they bring your body home. Otherwise, I'll disown you. That, to me, sort of captures this, and I've heard equivalent statements from African-American parents to their children.
Okay, now, what other factors in Erice's childhood and adolescence do you feel affected his development?
Well, I think he had a number of experiences of adversity.
Okay, well, what do you mean by adversity?
Well, adversity are commonly recognized negative experiences. In this case, I usually have 10 questions that I ask to get at that in somebody's childhood and adolescence. These 10 questions are called the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale. They're used very widely around the country to identify elements of adversity while you're growing up in the first 18 years of life.
So what's the purpose of sort of defining or narrowing down these adverse experiences?
Well, there's two reasons. One, in an informal interview, it gives me an agenda of things to cover, topics that I want to make sure I cover, but the research on these 10 aspects of adversity has shown that they're very powerful in being related to outcomes, that scores from sort of 0 to 10, the more adversity people have, it accounts for about half of the variation in things like depression, suicidal behavior, substance abuse. It's very powerful in predicting health problems like high blood pressure, extreme obesity. So it's a very useful list of 10 topics to cover.
Okay. And did you go through this questionnaire with Erice?
I did.
Okay. Now, what did you gather from his answers to that questionnaire?
Well, he said yes to 6 of the 10, and in each case where he said yes, I asked him, so what specifically are you thinking about, to elaborate a bit and give it more detail.
Okay, so what's the first adversity that you identified?
There's a question about did a parent or some other adult ever hit you so hard you had marks or were injured? And he talked about being whipped in a way that left welts, and so that would qualify there.
Okay, and what else?
On the question, did you often feel, it says you didn't have enough to eat or had to wear dirty clothes or had no one to protect you, he said yes to that based on no one to protect you, that not having an effective father in the home, he felt unprotected, and in fact he went on to say that's why I always like guns, because he felt vulnerable.
Okay. Now, what else were identified as adversities in his childhood?
Were your parents ever separated or divorced? There's another item, number 7, about domestic violence in the home, and he talked about when he said yes, and he talked about when he said yes when he was in 2nd grade. His mother had a boyfriend named Johnny. They got in a fight, and Eriese picked up a baseball bat to try to protect his mother from this man.
Now, that's 4 you've gone through. Are there? You said there were 6?
Yeah, let's see. Did a household member go to prison? You know, he discovered that his biological father was in prison. 2, 3, 4. So I think that's 6.
Now, part of that is, or one of the adversities that you identified have anything to do with abusive behaviors by adults in his life?
Well, he did say yes to the question, did a parent or other adult in the household swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you? And he talked about a boyfriend of his mother's, Lionel, I believe his name, who was very, very strict and would, as punishment, require him to strip down to his underwear and stand in front of the open front door of the house, which I think would be understood as degrading, humiliating treatment. I think that's the 6th one.
Now, you said that there was another. You said that there was another questionnaire that you also filled out in order to narrow down these adversities, but also to identify assets. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us about what that? Why would you need to identify assets?
Well, it's important to know, what the positives are in addition to the negatives. Sometimes you have a lot of buildup of negatives and no compensatory positives. Sometimes you have positives. So this is called the 40 Developmental Assets. It was developed in Minnesota. It's a way of finding out positive aspects of life for children and teenagers.
Okay, so you said children and teenagers. So this asset information, what age range is this limited to?
This is limited up to age 18, and with someone who's older, you're asking them to look back to before they were 18.
So in this case, Eriese obviously was 25, so he was over 18.
That's right.
So in your instructions to him, what did you tell him about that?
I told him I want you to think about when you were a teenager and a child, because this is about the first 18 years, and I repeated that several times. If there might be, he'd be hemming and hawing about whether, yes or no to a question, I would just remind him it's your first 18 years.
Okay, now, what did you gather from that particular questionnaire?
Well, this questionnaire covers things like supportive family relationships, support from school, support from neighborhood and community, cultural things that you might do, reading for pleasure, sports.
What are some of the things that he indicated to you were his assets?
Before I receive a lot of love and support from my family members. My school provides clear rules and consequences for me. I like to learn new things. I accept and take personal responsibility. I try to resolve conflict nonviolently.
Stop at that one for a second. I want to ask you about that one. What would that normally mean to you?
Well, normally means somebody who as a teenager, didn't have a history of aggression, fighting, violent behavior.
Is there anything else that he saw as an asset while he was a teenager?
I believe my life has a purpose. I feel positive about my personal future. Again, always reminding him this is the first 18 years.
Okay. So just so it's clear, this questionnaire was asking Erice about how he felt about his life when he was in childhood and adolescence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Dr. Garbarino, you have been listed as a defense witness in this case, right?
Yes.
Okay. And, sir, are you paid to be here?
Yes.
Okay. So, you often testify for the defense, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And have you ever testified for the prosecution in any case?
Yes.
Okay, can you tell us about that?
That was actually a case in Florida a number of years ago called the Baby Lollipops case, and it was a death penalty case, and it was a death penalty case, and I was asked by the prosecution.
Okay, so you told us earlier that you've testified, and I believe you said 70 cases?
Well, I think I've been involved in 70. I've probably testified in more than 50. It's hard to keep track of the number.
Okay, and so obviously by those numbers, the great majority of your testimony is for the defense. So can you explain that to the jury?
Well, I would say it's because I get asked by the defense, because what I tend to focus on is trying to understand how somebody moves through childhood and adolescence to get to the point where they do a terrible crime like this. Typically, the defense is interested in having that explanation, and ordinarily the prosecution isn't. That explanation, and ordinarily the prosecution isn't. That they don't want to have that explanation of how you get there.
Okay. Now, Dr. Garbarino, without telling us what it is, do you have views on the death penalty?
I do, as a person.
Okay. Now, are you able to separate your personal views about the death penalty when you render professional testimony or opinions as you did here today?
It's difficult, but I believe I am, yes.
Okay. And you talked about earlier hyperarousal, terror, and rage. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, that particularly young children, when they're exposed to threatening or scary situations, they tend to get hyper-aroused. This is part of what leads it to be traumatic. They may be very fearful, and some of them, particularly boys, may eventually respond with aggression, because part of the male sort of code is it's better to be mad than to be sad.
Okay, and how would you define for this jury the term social toxin?
I use the term social toxin to refer to some social or cultural influence which is poisonous. It's like if you live in a city with air pollution. Just by breathing there, you're affected by it. And some people are more affected than others. If you had a smog alert in your city, children with asthma, old people with emphysema would be more affected by the air pollution. And social toxins are like that. Values, beliefs, institutional patterns, historical issues, which are sort of generally poisonous to development, but some people are more vulnerable. A good example being media violence. That the research now after 50 years shows that the effect of TV violence on children's aggressive behavior, that effect is about as strong as the effect of smoking on lung cancer. Now, 19% of people who get lung cancer have never smoked. Most people who smoke will never get lung cancer, but we now know it increases the risk enough to say that smoking is bad for your health. And the same thing is true of TV violence.
Okay, and based on your expertise in developmental psychology, what is your professional opinion in regards to social toxins and Eriese Tisdale?
Well, I think the social toxins of racism and the Southern culture of honor, and the fact that he, these 6 adverse childhood experiences that he had, means that he had more adversity, based on national data, more adversity than 98% of other kids growing up. So he had a lot of socially toxic influences on his development.
Okay, now you just said something you said that he fell in what percentage rate? I'm sorry.
Well, he in the top 2% of adversity with a score of 6.
Okay, and that's based on the questionnaire that you did with him, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, now, with all of the testimony that you've given to the jury about racism, about Southern culture of honor, and about the social toxins within someone's childhood and adolescent development, Doctor, are these excuses?
No, these
Yours to say that day on
no.
February 28, 2013?
No, these are not excuses. The horribleness of it. I mean, it breaks my heart to hear the victim impact statements. I think all of us are affected. This is not designed to excuse it, but to offer a developmental explanation of how his childhood and adolescence propelled him into this period of his life in his 20s when he committed this terrible crime.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. McAdoo.
Doctor, did you bring your deposition with you today?
I did not.
No. I thought that might be the case, so I made you a copy.
Thank you.
We had to do it in 2 different parts, correct?
Yes.
So the first one, and they're all consecutively numbered. The first part is the first day, and the second part is the part we did Saturday, okay?
Okay.
Now, you have the rest of your materials with you, your notes?
I do.
Right. So your profession, just so we're all clear on this, is you are a professor, correct?
Yes.
A professor of psychology.
Yes.
And as it relates to your work in this arena and capital litigation, this is something you do in addition to your teaching duties, is that correct?
Yes.
And how much of your time would you estimate professionally is dedicated to your duties as a capital litigation expert?
Well, averaging across a year, the time, 20%, 15%.
And the defense asked you, obviously you're not here out of, for just some altruistic reason. You're being paid, right?
I am being paid.
And what is your hourly rate?
The hourly rate is $250 an hour, which I understand is the typical rate, if anything lower than a lot of other people offer.
I don't begrudge you your fee.
Thank you.
What's your total bill at this stage of the proceedings?
Well, up until the time we had the first deposition, I think when you asked me then, I said $5,000, but checking it was probably $4,000, so I probably put in as much time in addition since then, including today.
Okay, so north of $10,000, fair to say when we're all said and done?
I'd say south of $10,000, maybe 10,000.
All right. Now, Ms. Miranda asked you about this, generally, without stating your opinions, your feelings about the death penalty, and you indicated that you were personally opposed to the death penalty, correct?
Yes, both as a Catholic and as a psychologist.
Right. So it's both, you are both professionally and personally opposed to the death penalty, correct?
Yes, I come to that position from two different pathways, yes.
Right. And in fact, you indicated to me in your deposition that you were, quote, very sympathetic to the movement to abolish the death penalty, correct?
Yes.
In fact, you are even on record saying that you do not believe that the punishment of life without the possibility of parole makes sense from a developmental perspective, correct?
I believe I said particularly for young people, teenagers, but yes, I think I said that.
Well, no, you didn't only say young people, doctor. You told me, and you told a colleague of mine in a prior proceeding, that maybe potentially even up to the age of 30, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that's not young people, just so we're clear, right? That's 30 is, for my family, middle age. But that's a little older than teenagers, right?
It's older than teenagers, but looking back at it from 68 sounds pretty young to me.
All right. Now, in your career as a capital litigation expert, how many cases have you been retained in? Do you know?
I believe it's about 70, 75 maybe.
So 70 plus cases, correct?
Yes.
And other than the baby lollipop case, which was 30 years ago down in Miami, or see something that indicated that when you got into the baby lollipop case, you didn't know what the state's position was with respect to the death penalty?
That's correct.
Okay. And so as you reflect back on that, you probably wouldn't have wanted to be involved in that case either, correct?
Well, I would have agreed to be involved. I would have liked to have known.
Okay. And do you recall on a prior occasion, and you and I talked about this, I think twice in our various depositions, but a conversation with a colleague where he asked you, would you be willing to review a state case? Would you be willing to be retained by the state and review a case? Remember that?
I believe so, yes.
And tell the jury what you said to him in response to that question.
I believe I said I'd be willing to, but I doubt you'd want the answer that I would give.
Okay, now, so that we're clear, you say that without having one shred of evidence to render your opinion in that case, correct?
No?
Well, hold on. I understand we're going to get to this in great detail, but in direct response to that question, you have no idea what the facts and circumstances of the case are. What the facts and circumstances of the case are, correct?
Only that the prosecution would be asking me to do a developmental analysis.
My point is, as we talk about your personal and professional feelings about the death penalty, you must acknowledge that there's the potential that those feelings are so strong that they could affect and impact your impartiality or lack of bias as you approach a case. Is that fair to say?
In extreme, that's fair to say, sure.
Okay. When you take a case, you assume that you're going to find something that is helpful to the defense, correct?
I assume that I'm going to find that these things don't come out of nowhere, they're not without causes, and so I'm, based on my experience and knowledge of development, I'm expecting to find a cause for whatever terrible thing was done.
Okay. And you approach a case assuming that you're going to find a host of adverse factors, adverse developmental factors that we've been discussing here all morning in the defendant's background, correct?
Having done this for 20 years, I've grown to expect that, yes.
Right. Because in your experience of 20 plus years and looking at, I mean, you even wrote a book called Talking to Killers, right?
Listening to killers.
Listening to Killers. And in your experience in listening to killers, you've identified the factors in their background many, many times, correct?
I, among others, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about some of that. But what I want to talk about is when we address these factors that you generally find when you're retained by the defense, I want to talk about whether they're here in this case, okay?
Okay.
So one of the things is an absence of a parent, correct?
That's
Right.
often there, yes.
And we know that in this case, the defendant, father was absent from his life, correct?
Yes.
And we know that that's not good. The best case scenario is two parents.
Yes.
Okay. But your research shows, and your opinion is, that when it comes to the absence of a parent, the most damaging absent parent is the absence of a mother in a person's life, right?
Yes.
He had a mother in his life, didn't he?
He did?
And he had a mother that you interviewed and spoke with, correct?
Yes.
And she loved him, didn't she? Loves him. She loves him.
Yes. Yes.
And he had not only a loving mother, but he had an extended family of people who cared for him and nurtured him, correct?
Yes.
And those are a couple of things you don't find in a lot of the cases you look at, right? Right?
I would say you sometimes find that there's an extended family support, but I'd say he's certainly in the upper levels of getting family support.
Right, right. He's got that support work. And not only the mother and the aunts, but there were positive male role models in his life as well, correct?
There were some in addition to the negative ones.
So to the extent that he doesn't have a father, that's mitigated a little bit because he had extended family with male role models that could help him along in life, teach him life lessons and so forth, correct?
To some degree, yes.
One of the things you talk about in these adverse factors is living in a war zone. Why don't you tell them what a war zone is? What is a war zone?
Well, About 30 years ago, more, I began to look at the experience of children growing up in official war zones in the Middle East, in Africa, Central America, and was struck by the comparison with children growing up in urban war zones in the United States, places like inner city Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Miami. And so I developed and have this quality of war zones when there's a lot of community violence existing there.
Okay, so you're analogizing real war zones, active war zones with some of our larger cities, our Detroits, our Miamis, and so forth, where there is daily murders and crimes of violence and that are occurring all around an individual, correct?
Yes.
And that affects them. Developmentally, that impacts or affects how they grow and develop as a human being, correct?
It's an important influence.
It damages them, is your position, correct?
Often, yes.
Now, to be fair, there are hundreds, correct?
That's correct.
And that do not rape, and that
That's
do
correct.
not steal, correct?
That's correct.
Now, let's talk about him. He lives in Jupiter, Florida. Now, Jupiter, Florida, and this Stone Creek, Cold Creek neighborhood or whatever, wasn't a war zone, right?
I think it had a lot of, as I understand it, had significant issues, but not on the same level with places in Chicago that I'm familiar with.
Maybe, and we'll be able to hear from his family members and friends about that, but you talked to him, murders daily in that neighborhood. There wasn't rampant crime and criminal activity, correct?
Correct.
So he's got that going for him, doesn't he? That's a plus,
That's a plus, yes.
or the absence of a negative, however you'd like to put it. And in fact, we're going to hear from one of them, but they had one of their neighbors, a decent, hard-working woman, raised her kid went off to college, now is in the NFL. You familiar with that story?
I think,
Then he went to school. And he didn't go to school in Detroit, he didn't go to school in Miami, he went to school down in Palm Beach County, Florida, right?
yes.
And these were decent schools, right?
To the best of my knowledge, I don't know, but I assume so.
And again, not only that, but one of the things you would find as an adverse factor in somebody's background is they did really poor in school, right?
It's not part of these 10 questions, but it's certainly a risk factor.
Something you look at, you want to know
Yes.
about that, right?
Yes.
You ask about that, don't you?
Yes, we had to talk about school.
And he did fine in school, didn't he?
He did.
Difficulties, any maybe dyslexia or anything of that nature that was reflected in any of his school records. You looked at his school records, didn't you?
I believe he was in the gifted program at some point.
The gifted program.
Yes, sir.
You don't see a lot of that when you're talking to killers, do you?
No, it's a small minority who have that kind of intellectual background, but it does exist.
The records clearly reflect that he is of average intelligence, at least, correct?
Yes.
Cope with life, if you will, correct? From an intellectual position.
It certainly is one of the factors for resilience, at least average intellectual ability.
And we're even going to hear from a couple of people that he worked for. And at least one of them is going to say he did a good job for him and showed up on time and things of that nature. You're familiar with that, right?
Yes, I heard
And
that.
you don't see that when you're talking to killers, do you?
As well, sometimes you do, but often you don't.
And then the big, which is abuse and trauma. So when we talk about is abuse and trauma. So when we talk about abuse, let's talk first about physical abuse. We've seen some of the most traumatic, horrific forms of physical abuse known to man, correct?
Yes, sir.
Not just beatings, but torturous beatings, physical abuse on a magnitude that's unimaginable, correct?
Unfortunately, yes.
But not for him. Not for him, right? You didn't see that in his background, did you?
No, he reports being whipped to the point of getting welts,
Yeah.
which is significant, but is not what you and I are talking about for the most severe physical abuse.
Single mother trying to raise her kid and trying to control him as best she can. And you got some spankings, you got some whippings with a belt. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yes, and may I respond to that, or you want to?
You can, I'm sure
Okay.
we'll let you
Okay.
elaborate.
All
What
right.
I'm saying is, in this case, nothing that is significant physical abuse. You're talking whipping, correct? Spanking.
Whipping.
Okay. And then there's neglect, the kind of neglect that makes your skin crawl. dilapidated homes, feces, toilets overflowing, rotten food in refrigerators. That's neglect of a parent of a child, correct?
That's one kind of neglect, yes.
Right, and that's damaging, right?
Certainly often is, yes.
He had a roof over his head.
Yes.
He had food. He had clothing, correct?
Right, he didn't claim that as an issue for adversity.
Right, and if he didn't claim it, you're not assuming it's there, right?
Right.
And you see that. You see that type of abuse as well, neglectful abuse, when you're talking to killers, don't you?
Often, yes.
And then there's, of course, sexual abuse.
Yes.
And the damage that that does to a human psyche is just unimaginable, correct?
Well, it's unfortunately imaginable, but
Yeah.
yes.
Right. And you see that a lot when you're talking to killers, don't you?
Particularly with females, but to some degree with males as well.
And there's not any evidence, not one shred of evidence, not any indication that he was sexually abused any way, shape, or form, correct?
No, and it's not something he claimed on the adversity questionnaire.
And then finally, what you characterize in your writings and in your speeches on the internet is most damaging abuse, psychological abuse.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And what is that? Tell us what psychological abuse is.
Well, psychological abuse or psychological maltreatment is ways of treating children that undermines their basic emotional needs, that assaults them emotionally, verbally, using humiliation, fear, degrading, rejecting. There's a whole series of 5 or 6 elements that, as you know, I've written about.
And then when you're talking to murderers, they have reports of that kind of experience, psychological abuse at the hands of a parent or a caregiver, right?
They very often do, yes.
But he didn't, did he?
Well, I would disagree about that because he does speak about his mother working so much and being sort of unavailable to him, so he was unsupervised, feeling lonely, and I think that, there's a psychological unavailability is certainly something significant, particularly for a boy who needs a lot of supervision to resist temptation.
Because his mother worked hard to keep the lights on and food in the refrigerator and clothes on his back, that's psychological abuse in your assessment? That could be taken as psychological abuse by him?
Working 2 or 3 jobs in order to keep the roof over their head can inadvertently lead to a lack of supervision and even a feeling of abandonment on the child's part. So possibly yes.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the ACE, which is the test that you administer to him, the Adverse Childhood Experience Test, where you're trying to ascertain, kind of where he falls, right? You scored him at a 6.
Well, as you know from our previous discussions, it doesn't say test. I don't think of it as a test. It says questionnaire. And
find your score.
Find your score, yes. How many of these do you have? So, yes, I said we came up with 6.
Okay. Let's take them one at a time. The first one you score, and so it's basically if they say yes, you put a 1. If they say no, you put a 0 up, and that's your score, right?
Right.
So the first one is, did a parent or other adult in the house, and then it's emboldened, meaning I guess there's some emphasis, it's in bold, right, often, and then either swear at you or assault you or put you down to or humiliate you, and that's not what he said yes to, is it?
He did say yes to that.
He said that a parent or other adult in the house often did those things?
Referring to this man Lionel, who was his mother's boyfriend, who was in the house for a year, who engaged in these degrading practices. That's what he was referring to there.
So for a period of 1 year, and that would qualify as often, that's your testimony, okay?
Yes.
All right. And then also, was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, and that you scored as a 1 as well, correct?
Well, there's 2 other stems. Sometimes they're often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes, or threatened with a knife or a gun. And he said yes to that.
Yes to which one?
When I asked him, what are you referring to, he talked about this boyfriend, Johnny, who used to get in more than one occasion his mother, and that's where he reported trying to protect her by getting a baseball bat.
Right, this is the same guy that he answered 1, 2 in the first question.
No, that was Lionel, I believe.
I know. Did you read his mother's deposition that we took?
I may have, I'm not sure. If I did, it's been a while.
Are you aware that her testimony, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have it in front of me, was to the effect that she kicked this guy out of the house pretty early, one of these guys, pretty early in the process because there's some military guy who was a very strict disciplinarian or rule follower or what have you? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I believe that's Lionel. And what I see is after a year of relationship.
And then you initially scored 0, but then crossed it out and put a 1 for did a household member go to prison?
And I'm not saying I didn't score this. He at first said no, but then he thought about his biological father being in prison, and so changed his answer to a 1.
But his biological father never lived in the house. He didn't even know who his biological father was, correct?
Not until he was, I don't know, 12 or something. So that's why I think why he was debating whether to score it yes or no.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're administering this. Wouldn't you say to him, look, that wouldn't count because that's not a household member? You don't offer any guidance as to how the test should be taken?
I do offer some guidance. It's not a test. It's an attempt to get them to answer questions, and I'm mostly interested in how they answer the question and then following up. So that's, he also mentioned, I think he mentioned a half-brother who went to prison. I have that written in my note as well. So he was sort of unclear about that.
I saw a half-brother down there, but then you testified on direct that it was his father, so I'm confused. Was it his half-brother or his father, and who was this half-brother? I've never heard of him.
Well, I'm just reading the note that I have here, and that I wrote after, presumably that's what he said, because
So when the zero's crossed out, you crossed out the 0 and put the 1 in. You're filling this out.
After, he has a version that, and I'm copying what he's doing, so he has the same questionnaire and he's answering, and I'm recording, and then, because my notes don't appear on his filled out form.
Okay. Now, so we looked at all of these horrible things that can happen in a child's life that could affect their view of the world and their behavior. You have previously testified that the presence of these adverse developmental factors and trauma have been observed by you in 85% of the individuals you've examined over the years, correct?
That some of these, or?
Well, go on. It's in 2 places in your depo if you want to look to refresh your recollections. At page 50, line 9, and
okay.
It's also at page 109, line 15.
All right, let's check that. Is that in the...
I'm sorry, I misspoke. It's 50, line 19. I beg your pardon.
Okay. All right. I often say that, maybe 85% of murder cases are very similar in the sense you have childhood abuse and trauma and deprivation and abandonment and all that sort of thing. But then there are other cases where you don't. So I wasn't giving a specific number on this. I was talking more generally that most of the time what you see is, as you suggested before, this combination of abuse, trauma, neglect in maybe 85% of the cases. But that... Okay.
Statistically speaking, 85% is quite a bit more than a little more than not, correct?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
Well, you said, I often see these more often than not. But what your testimony in your deposition was that you're seeing a host of these factors, a multitude of these factors, in 85% of the murderers that you're talking to, right?
They're very similar in the sense they have childhood abuse and trauma and deprivation and abandonment. So 85% of the time, they typically have a large accumulation of these risk factors. Not unusual to have 8, 9, or 10.
Okay. You recall, go to page 109, line 15, where I asked you, and I get your analogy and I appreciate it, but the number you came to is 85% of the killers that you've seen over the years have a whole host of various mixtures of all these bad things in their life, right?
Yes.
And you say that's true.
I think that's a good number.
And therefore, just so the jury understands, he's not in that 85%, is he?
He's in the 50.
Thank you very much,
Okay.
sir. And before you answer that question, I want to be very fair to you, and I'll go ahead and let you take a look at page 111, line 4 of your deposition.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll ask, more like that 15%, isn't it? He's in the 15%.
That's what I said, yes.
In fact, not only did you say that, but you categorized him and the circumstances of this crime or the manner in which this crime was committed as making his murder very unusual. You remember that?
I don't specifically remember that, but I would agree with that.
Okay. It's different. This case is different than the vast, overwhelming majority of murderers that you've spoken with, isn't it?
Yes, to a significant degree.
Now, you also talked about developmental assets, because those assets, where you may have some deficits, if you have assets to overcome those, you might be better able to address life's problems, correct? So that's simple. And ultimately, you concluded that your overall assessment of his developmental assets would also suggest that there was an absence of abuse and neglect in his life, correct?
That he reported 16 of these 40 assets, which is about average for American kids.
Let's get that test out, Don. You got it?
Yeah, I got it.
The test?
I have the the questionnaire, yes.
Okay, well, we're not talking about the ACE now. We're talking about the assets. How do you score? Take this quiz.
Yes.
You're not quibbling that this is a test, right? It's a quiz.
Yeah, I think, it's developed to use mainly with teenagers, and that's the way they understand it. But it's not a psychological test the way things like the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory, any of those things,
Right.
those are considered heavy-duty psychological tests. This is just a checklist of experiences for a kid.
Right, heavy-duty psychological test that were not administered in this case, correct?
Right, and I don't do that.
Okay. Now, take that quiz out. How about if we call it a quiz? We'll meet in the middle?
All right, okay.
Okay, great. Take the quiz out. You said to this jury that he scored...
And down here, yeah.
Go ahead and count it.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Oh, 20. My error. 20.
20.
Above average.
He's above average in his assets.
Yes.
And I asked you yesterday, we had a conversation, you may remember this, and what I really want to talk to you about is I try to resolve conflicts non-violently. And I said, that in the context of what we're talking about here, that would be a lie. And you said it could either be a lie or it could be what?
Well, since this applies to ironic, I think is the word I used. It'd be ironic that he would say that given what happened in his mid-20s.
Okay. Tell the jury what the concept of resiliency is, sir.
Resilience is the ability, capacity to overcome adversity, to bounce back from adversity, to sort of right yourself after you've been knocked over by difficult life experiences, that sort of thing.
Right. Resiliency enables you to deal with life's problems as they come at you, right? And pick yourself up by your bootstraps, right?
Those are the kind of expressions people use, yes.
So let's talk about his resiliency. When you gauge in somebody's resiliency or an ability of an individual to act or react or think their way through a problem and handle it in a way that doesn't cause, that they're not totally incapable of dealing with, one of the things you want to know is, like, what's their intelligence, correct?
That's one of the things that's related to resilience, yes.
Right. And so a person with average intelligence is more likely to be resilient, correct?
Than a person with less than average, yes.
Right. And of course we know he has average intelligence, right?
Probably above average.
And you indicated one of the things, or we've talked about this, but one of the things that makes an individual is writing or sports or music, right?
Yes.
And he was an aspiring rapper, right?
Yes, he was.
Right? And he was into that big time, right?
Yes.
So that makes him more resilient than your average, the murderers you've talked to, right?
Yes.
And another thing is that makes you resilient is if you have at least one person in your life who truly loves you, right?
Yes.
And he had that in spades with his family.
Yes.
That makes him more resilient than the average murderer you talk to, right?
Yes.
And a positive disposition, and those were reported to you as well, a positive disposition, correct?
Yes.
The intelligence, the ability to address situations of racism in his life. I mean, when he's confronted with racism, he had the ability to deal with those, correct?
And I think evidence of that is in his first 18 years of life, unlike most of the killers, he doesn't have a history of antisocial aggression, and that sort of thing that you often find, school failure, that sort of stuff. To me, that's because he had this foundation for resilience to deal with that much adversity. Remember, if he's got 6 of the adverse childhood experiences, that puts him in the top 2% in adversity, and it's sort of unusual for somebody to be doing as well as he was, graduate from high stuff that he was doing, and I think part of the explanation is his resilience and the fact that he had, above average number of assets.
I just want to make sure we're fair about that. You talked about antisocial behavior, right?
Antisocial aggressive behavior.
Aggressive behavior, but you're not saying you didn't see evidence of antisocial behavior?
No, okay. I'm not saying that.
All right. Now, you met with him at the county jail, didn't you?
Yes.
And do you remember how you introduced yourself to him?
Well, I told him my name, I told him where I teach in the university, I told him a bit about my life, my kids, my experiences for about 20 years, and that I was there to try to understand his life, that particularly as a child and as an adolescent.
And do you remember telling him, quote, I was there as part of his team, his defense team?
Yes, I believe I said that, yes.
You got to agree with me. That's not a real objective way to start out this process, right? By saying, I'm here as part of your team.
Well, it's truthful.
Okay.
I know I was introduced that way in any case, so whether I said it or not, I was introduced by his defense attorney as came to be part of the case, so there was no deception or unclarity about that.
All right, now in the formation of your opinions as you talked with him, one of the things that was important to you was to understand what type of encounters he's had with law enforcement that might explain in this Southern culture of honor and his dealings with racism might explain the events of the 28th of February 2013, correct?
May we approach?
Yes, ma'am. Members of the jury, I'm going to take up a matter outside of y'all's presence for just a few minutes. I apologize for the interruption. If you'll bear with us, we'll have you back shortly. Please don't discuss the case. All right, the jury's outside the courtroom. All counsel present, please.
Your Honor, may I use the restroom while you deal with this?
Yes, sir. We'll go off the record just a minute.